So welcome back to the Anglotopia podcast. This week I have with me Justin Reish, who is the Executive Director of the International Churchill Society. The International Churchill Society was founded in 1968, shortly after the death of Churchill, to keep the memory and legacy of Churchill alive. I've been a member myself for many years, and I'm heavily involved in my local chapter here in Chicago. And I'm excited to be attending the upcoming International Churchill Conference in London this October. And we're going to talk about that later in the episode. So, welcome, Justin.
Hey, thank you. I really appreciate it, Jonathan.
Thanks for coming on. So can you go ahead and introduce yourself and the ICS and tell our readers the kind of work that it does?
Yeah, sure. So I'm Justin Reish, the Executive Director of the International Church Society. I've held this role for 4 years now, but I've been involved with the organization for 11 years. We are a 501c3 nonprofit here in the United States and a registered charity in the United Kingdom. We're a global membership organization, so we have about 3,000 plus members around the world. We have chapters everywhere from Brazil to Iceland to Australia, and of course the United States. And the mission of the society is, by celebrating the timeless values of Sir Winston Churchill, ICS will embolden all generations to understand the historical context of his life and defend, enhance, and promote the values that he embodied, which are freedom, democracy, and human rights. And we do this through, many ways. We have a quarterly publication called Finest Hour, which you receive as a member. We have a resource-filled website, winstonchurchill.org, which is easy to remember. And we host regional and national and international events. Culminating in the conference, which we'll get to. And as we are an educational, 501c3, we take those duties and that mission very seriously. And where I am based in Washington, D.C. is at the National Churchill Leadership Center, which is housed at George Washington University. So we have a presence on a major American university campus.
Sounds awesome. Sounds like good work that you guys do. And I'm glad that there's an organization out there that's focused on, keeping his words alive and keeping his mission alive and sort of educating the public on Churchill stuff, which is something we're going to get to. Now, so how did you get interested in Winston Churchill? What's your Churchill story?
Sure. So I studied history as an undergraduate, and I specified in British history. And when I graduated college in 2012, I moved to Chicago to go to graduate school, which was at night, and I needed a job. And I was looking around all of the, trying to find a job online. And the university that I attended, DePaul University, had a job website. And I just so happened to stumble upon what was then called the Churchill Center, which was located in Chicago. And they were looking for, a full-time but junior person. And I applied and I, got the job. So I worked at what was then known the Churchill Center from January 2013 until fall of 2015. And then I moved on to another role for 5 years. Then I came back as executive director. But in that time, I still helped out with all of our conferences, various things. And so I think with, my Churchill story is like many people probably my age, in the sense of you kind of come to it indirectly. I certainly knew of Winston Churchill when I was studying, and, I've always had a fond love of history, looking at my dad's bookshelf growing up, would study, his books of World War II. So I knew of Winston Churchill as this, kind of Tommy gun-toting, cigar-chomping person who, was British and saved the war in many ways. But I didn't really get to it until it became my profession, if you will.
Interesting. Now, I'm very excited about the upcoming conference. So can you tell the Anglotopia podcast listeners all about it and what they can expect to happen at this conference and what goes on?
Yes, of course. So we host an annual conference every year. Last year was in Edinburgh, Scotland. This year's in London. Next year will be in Washington, D.C. in the fall. And these conferences are the single most significant source of engagement for us. Even we have roughly 300 people. When I say significant engagement, I mean sponsors, attendees. It's a 3-day affair. We begin this conference with a reception at Dartmouth House, which is in Mayfair and is the home of the English Speaking Union. Winston Churchill was a president of the ESU in the 20s and 30s. So there's a strong Churchill connection there. The next day on Friday, we host lecture sessions all day at our host hotel, the JW Marriott on Park Lane. And these sessions go from historical, professors and authors to we have James Cleverly, the former Foreign Secretary and Home Secretary, who'll be speaking on the lunch keynote. And then we end with Lord Roberts of Belgravia, who wrote, Churchill Walking with Destiny. So we really go from let's focus on the history part, and we bring him into the present. Why is he still so relevant today? How does he inform, the actions taken by sitting politicians and others? And it's an important year because this year, 2024, is the 150th anniversary of his birth, and this conference is really aligned to celebrate that momentous occasion. And then Saturday, we continue conference sessions at the Royal United Services Institute. And then we end with a phenomenal black tie gala dinner at the National Gallery. And if your listeners know the National Gallery, it's the colonnaded building in Trafalgar Square. We've rented that out privately. So it's going to be a phenomenal time. And it's a mixture of, education, but also experience. And the people that go, so many have gone for many years. They actually meet up with each other. They plan their travel together. They go, as couples. And ICS is a very big family. And so you get that very strong sense of camaraderie and friendship, which, everybody, it just, that's the bedrock of our organization for sure.
Yeah, that's one thing I'm really looking forward to kind of becoming part of the club, because it's going to be my first Churchill conference. I know me and the Chicago contingent are already making plans and
Good.
and looking forward to coming, because we try to get together every few months here.
Yeah, and I'll say one thing to add is, these conferences, we, for a long time, up until probably when I started, the conferences were very history focused, which is fine and understandable. I mean, that's the most natural thing. But what we realized was first time attendees or people who didn't really know much about Winston Churchill, but were intrigued and interested, could kind of feel a little excluded because they hadn't read all of the books and they didn't know the difference between this speaker and that speaker. And we really wanted to get away from that sense of exclusivity. And so when you call it a club, it definitely feels that way. But I feel like it's more of a large friend group, because you have people who are coming just for like the social sessions, right? Who want to go to Lancaster House, which I didn't mention, which is on Friday night. Lancaster House is the setting for The Crown. So all of the internal palace scenes in The Crown, the Netflix show, are filmed at Lancaster House. So it's this beautiful, phenomenal space. And so we've really grown our audience to go from, hey, I know everything about Winston Churchill, let me critique the speakers, to more of a broader tent of I'm interested, I like his leadership style, I really like champagne, I like getting dressed up and, going to black tie dinner. So we've really broadened our audience, it's paid off for us in many ways, A, in a sense of having a more diverse, group of attendees, but B, it continues, the conferences are a major revenue generator. We're a nonprofit. We survive solely on individual contributions. We have no money from the government. We have very little money from, large foundations. So individual donors, members, and the people who attend the conference, that's 95% of our revenue. So it behooves us as an organization to be as broad as possible, for sure.
Yeah, I know one thing I'm looking forward to is going to those special buildings that you can't normally go inside,
Yeah.
and seeing them. It's just going to be a treat. And I know that it's going to be an exciting weekend. And I like to say I know a lot about Churchill, but I'm also looking forward to learning a lot about Churchill. I'm also looking forward to meeting some of the eminent historians and speakers that are going to be speaking there. I think
Yeah.
that's going to be worth the price of admission alone. So, well, let's shift gears a little bit and talk about some sort of fun Churchill related topics. And when I sent you the questions in advance, I asked you some interesting Churchill questions. So I wanted to get your answer, and maybe I can give my answer as well.
Yeah.
So, what is your favorite Churchill quote?
Yeah. So I will give you three. I'll give
Okay.
you a serious quote, a fun quote, and then quotes about him by his
Okay.
contemporaries.
All
So
right.
the
I
the
like this.
serious, yeah, the serious quote is, and this came from when he was giving Neville Chamberlain's eulogy in the fall of 1940. He said, "quote History with its flickering lamp stumbles along the trail of the past, trying to reconstruct its scenes, to revive its echoes, enkindle with pale gleams the passion of former days." The reason I chose
Oh,
that quote is,
that's good.
as somebody who is, is a historian in various ways, or somebody who loves history, reads history, appreciates what it is. I think anybody who identifies with the need to understand history identifies with that quote in the sense of it is not cut and dry. History is not a straight line. History is a continuum, but it's not a straight line of he said, she said, he did, she did. And what he's evoking in this, in the most Churchillian fashion, is this sense of, and remember, he himself was a historian, right? He was a journalist, but he also wrote history books, won the Nobel Peace Prize for history, or sorry, Nobel Prize in literature for his history books. Um, he's evoking the everyday historian's challenge of trying to understand the past, which with its different norms, different set of expectations, different languages, different people. And what he's doing is, in that eulogy, the reason he brings in the eulogy is that he's referring judgment on an individual who was just trying to, do what's best for his country. And he's saying, like, hey, in 10, 50 years, historians are going to look back at Neville Chamberlain and they're going to go through this process that all historians do. And he just wants to make sure that he's getting his own contemporaneous thoughts of Neville Chamberlain in before the historians do. So such a wonderful eulogy. I encourage anyone to read it. It's not very long. And so, yeah, that was of many great Churchill quotes. I thought of that for sure. Let me go to the fun. And this is
Okay.
short and sweet. And the fun is, quote, first things first, get the champagne. So Churchill, a lover of champagne, most certainly Paul Roger, which I have a box right here.
Nice.
2012. That's a 2012 Churchill vintage. I was given as a present. I could never afford it my own, and I drank it, by the way, of course. That's such a Churchill thing to say, and even though he was a very verbose person, that quote it cuts the heart of the man loved the finer things in life. And there's another quote which I'm going to butcher, but it's essentially, um, you know, uh, I'll come back to it, but it's about being easily satisfied with the best. That's what Churchill was. He was easily satisfied with the best, and of course, with the best champagne. And I'll end this question with a quote about him. So there are great quotes about Winston Churchill of his contemporaries. I'll give you two because I just thought of the second one.
Okay.
And the first one, which I just thought of, is Harold Macmillan, former prime minister after Churchill, or after, excuse me, Anthony Eden, says of Churchill, and he's referring to him. He says, Winston is half English aristocrat, half American gambler. That's a phenomenal quote about Winston
Yeah.
Churchill because it really encapsulates him in many ways. But then the other quote about Churchill, which I love, is from Pamela Plowden, probably his first girlfriend, if we'll use that term. She said, quote, when you first meet Winston, you see all of his faults. Then you spend the rest of your life seeing all of his virtues. And that I feel like you could say that about Churchill, dead or alive, because I'm sure we'll get to this. He Churchill led from the front foot, right? FDR, the first time FDR met him in 1918, he said Winston Churchill was a stinker because he just lorded over the conversation. Churchill dominated conversation. He dominated the room, and that put a lot of people off. A lot of people didn't like him for a long time. But you would then see this side of him, this humanity, which comes through across the board, and that he would develop these very deep relationships with people because you see, he really was phenomenal in many ways. Of course, not great in other ways, like all of us. So I thought that quote was a great encapsulation of him and how
That,
people like experience him throughout life.
that is a great one. I've not seen that one before, so I'm gonna add that to my roster. That's really good. Excellent. Now, on the topic of anecdotes, what's your favorite Churchill story or anecdote that is attributed to him?
Sure. So there's quite a few. I'm sure somebody who's read about him, or people who've just kind of Googled him on the internet. There's quite a few that are apocryphal, never happened, but that are funny. Such as if I forget I think he was talking to Lady Asquith in the House of Commons where she said, Winston, if you were my husband, I'd put poison in
Oh,
tea.
Lady
And
Astor.
yeah, Lady Astor, not Asquith, and he replies, "And ma'am, if I was your husband, I would drink it."
Yeah.
Not sure. I don't know if that happened, but one that I really love, and amongst many, is when he visited the White House in 1941 after Pearl Harbor, when he essentially invited himself in all of his, military friends to stay at the White House for multiple weeks, annoying to the great annoyance of Eleanor Roosevelt. Um, he he's in so him and FDR, they kick off and they're really going well and they're planning for the war and they're thinking about how to save Western civilization and what Europe's going to look like afterwards, and FDR is writing down this document about nations coming together post-war to figure out the world. And he says, "Oh, I have this great name for this thing. I'm going to call it the United Nations, and I need to go tell Winston right now because it just came to me. And I'm really excited." It's late in the evening. FDR gets rolled, of course, in his wheelchair up to Churchill's room, and he's told, "Oh, Winston's in the bath." And Winston hears FDR, and Winston comes out and comes out naked. And FDR is taken aback, and Churchill says to him, "You see, the Prime Minister of Great Britain has nothing to hide from the President of the United States." And actually, people question this story, but FDR in his own diaries calls Churchill like a pink-skinned pig when he sees him naked. So it's again it's very indicative of his character and of who he was. That he wasn't a prude in that sense.
I love that story. It was I believe they dramatized it in Into the Storm, the HBO
Yes, they
movie.
did. Yeah,
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 and it was yeah. Now, if you had to recommend one book about Churchill or anyone interested in Churchill should read, what
yeah,
book should that be? And I know there's like 1,000 books about
yeah.
Churchill, so that's hard to narrow down.
I'm kind of looking around. So too, I mean, if you're going to read a biography, which I think some people unfairly judge biographies before they read them. If you're going to read a biography, like a comprehensive biography, certainly Andrew Roberts' Walking with Destiny. I mean,
Yeah.
it's 1,000 pages. It's really long. So you'd have to really dedicate yourself. There's two great books, I mean, many great books about Churchill. I'm trying to see if I have it here. I don't see it, but it's called. So if you're looking for like a really unique take on him, something unexpected, it's called No More Champagne, and this is about. I don't know if you've read this, but it's by
Yeah.
David Locke, and it's about his financial problems,
Yeah.
and it is exceedingly interesting and funny and depressing. And I learned so much in that book. I read it when it came out, what, in 17 or 18. So I highly like, okay, biography, Churchill Walking with Destiny, something unique and different, a different perspective. No More Champagne.
Yeah, that's it is really interesting because it's he was born into one of Britain's, greatest historical families, but he was the first son of a second son, so there was no
Yeah,
money for him, but yet he had aristocratic tastes and aristocratic expectations, and so he spent his whole life chasing basically financial success, and to some varying degrees of success. And that's why he was a writer, which many people don't know that he was a writer. And that was his actual career, because you weren't paid to be a politician back then. So he had to fall back on his words, and he, like you said, he won the Nobel Prize for it.
Yeah. Yeah, he definitely earned his income by writing, giving speeches, paid speeches, and he was very well compensated.
Yeah.
But he lost all of his money, a lot of, majority of his money in the 29 stock market crash, like a lot of people. He had a lot of money invested in American stocks. Um, he, he bought Chartwell, and then he had to do major refurbishments in the 20s. So it really was, kind of like peaks and valleys for him, for sure. And I think he only really genuinely got financial security post-war when they sold Chartwell to the National Trust, and guaranteed that they could live in it until they died. And I think they sold it for like £3 million at that time, which was a lot of money, of course, now. But yeah, he was perpetually in debt, perpetually. It's just like, I mean, he was
That
great at a
makes
lot
him
of things, but balancing a checkbook was certainly not his,
that
not
makes
his.
him even more relatable.
Yeah, right. Of course.
So, on the topic of that, what's your favorite Churchill movie or TV drama?
Yeah, I got to be honest with you. I don't love most of them. I think I'm just, I think there's something about working for the International Churchill Society, knowing many of his family members, and seeing the very stereotyped caricatures of Winston Churchill. However, I would probably say HBO's The Gathering Storm.
That's
It was
my
Albert
favorite.
Finney.
Yeah.
It was, yeah, that's probably my favorite because it doesn't go like it goes beyond the, I don't know, the like, he drank a lot and he smoked a lot and he, had this gravelly voice, but in actuality, he actually had quite a high pitched voice. If you listen to, his speeches that he recorded, fight them in the fields and on the beaches and in the streets and blood, toil, tears, and sweat. Those are recorded post-war. They were not recorded in the moment because there was no recording in Parliament. Those are speeches he gave to Parliament, and of course he acted for them and played them up. And so, but yeah, I would probably say HBO. I think it was early 2000s.
Yeah.
Gathering Storm is definitely my favorite.
That's actually my favorite too. And I think it's not particularly accurate, but I love that they shot it at Chartwell, and
Yeah, that's right.
you get a sense of him as a person that is accurate, I
Yes.
think. And whenever I'm at a low point, I just throw the Gathering Storm on, and my mood is immediately improved.
Good.
I have less nice things to say about the follow up they made.
Yeah, that was
Um,
Brendan Gleeson who played him, right?
yeah, I
Yeah,
wasn't a
I didn't
huge.
love that.
I didn't love that one either. I think he was wrong for Churchill. I think an Irishman playing Churchill
I agree.
would have made Churchill laugh
Yeah.
hilariously. But and it's a weaker story. But yeah, the Gathering Storm it's top telly for me, and it's getting harder and harder to find these days. But if you've got HBO Max, it's on HBO Max.
That's right. That's right.
So shifting gears a little bit, this is the part of the discussion I've really been looking forward to, because I know you probably have to deal with this on a daily basis, having to
Mm.
bat away Churchill myths and misinformation. So, in the current political and historiographical environment, what are some Churchill myths that keep persisting that drive you crazy?
Sure, and there's quite a few. I'll start with the quick ones. Like he was an alcoholic. Churchill was not an alcoholic. He drank a lot. He had a very large capacity to drink alcohol, but he wasn't dependent on it in any way. You know, there's
He's
always
English.
yeah, and people say, well, he would drink whiskey in the morning. He would drink exceptionally watered down whiskey because it was a habit he picked up when he was a soldier in India to, clear their drinking water of typhoid and any other sort of nasty illnesses. They would put whiskey in it. So it's a habit he picked up, just like a habit he picked up of smoking cigars in Cuba as a young war correspondent. And another thing, another easy one for me is that he had depression. Churchill referred to his black dog. He referred to it once, one time. He referred to his black dog, and he was going through a period of exceptional stress, And like any of us who are stable minded, we all have ups and downs. And he was going through an exceptionally hard period. And he was, depressed about it. However, that does not mean that he was a depressive, clinically depressive person.
Right.
So I think, that, also people when they talk about his depression, they point to one of his paintings. I don't know if you've seen this, but Chartwell, and it's one of his only self portraits, and it is of him holding his paintbrush and his easel, but the background is black. People say,
Yeah.
"Oh, like that's indicative of how he felt about the world," and very my point of view is very contrarian to that in the sense of Winston Churchill was an eternal optimist. He saw the humanity in people. He saw, the light at the end of the tunnel, whatever phrase you want to use. He saw the good side of life. And he lived that way as well. And now the more complicated issues are, Winston Churchill, like many historical figures recently, uh, you know, are perceived as being racist. And it is an exceptionally reductive conversation, in my opinion,
Yeah, I agree.
because Winston Churchill, when you read his writings, he uses the term. So people will point to, well, he uses the term race, the Indian race, the African race. Well, he also called the German race, the British race, the French race. He used the word race as we would use the word nation or peoples. French peoples, British nation, and he really so that's a semantic distinction.
Right.
But he also saw, I mean, Winston Churchill, this is my, of course, my individual opinion, but it's shared by many others, including David Reynolds, who wrote a great recent book called Churchill Mirrors of Greatness, which is right here. Mirrors of Greatness, Winston Churchill. This came out earlier this year. I highly recommend it. So it's
Yeah,
about
that's really good.
him and his contemporaries, and the chapter by far longest by far is him and Churchill and Gandhi. Churchill's worldview is not, skin focused. It was barbarism or civilization. That's it. Barbarism or civilization. And guess what? Any person could be in either camp.
Yeah.
You know, he referred many times to German barbarism. Germans are predominantly white, right? So that's this sort of, for me, this sort of, you know, um, reducing a historical individual to their worst comments or or trying to place the way that society has evolved from their time, rightfully, in many ways, trying to put that sort of evolution onto somebody who has not been part of that evolution, if you see what I mean.
Yeah.
Thus, what they said, what they did, what they wrote oftentimes doesn't translate into our evolved society. But that doesn't mean that we shouldn't, you know, refer to them in many ways, revere them in some ways, criticize them in other ways. So I think I get frustrated when, I hope, let me put it this way. I hope in 100 years, somebody doesn't judge me on the worst thing that I've said, or a point of view that I held when I was 15 or 20, which I clearly don't hold anymore, when I was 70. And it's that sort of like cherry picking quotes, actions, and saying, oh, no, no, no. Everything else he is reduced to this one quote. And I'll give you, there are plenty of examples. Winston Churchill, the great thing about Winston Churchill, he lived his life in the public domain. Pretty much everything he wrote and said, he didn't keep a diary. All of his letters are in the Churchill archive, so you can research them for free. He lived his life in the public eye. And the quotes that people criticize him for, there's this quote about, the American race will triumph over the Indian race, referring to Native Americans, or he advocated for using gas against Iraqis. And he was referring to mustard gas, not noxious gas or whatever. But of course, those little nuances are flattened out. And it's just this binary said equals bad, which not only is doing the dead person injustice, but it's doing the like, for me, the important essential work of historiography in injustice, because you're not giving yourself the opportunity to accept some certain things, check those out the door, and then really get into the primary sources. It's really just this reductive conversation.
Yeah, and the most of that conversation is happening on social media, and there's no room for nuance on social media at all whatsoever. And I've been in the social media trenches for 15 years. You know, our Facebook page is 200,000 people on it,
Wow.
and managing that amount of comments, at least, you know, is a challenge because you've
You just
got
got to turn
200.
them off. Just turn off the comments. You say you turn a lot. There's a
you,
lot
you,
of time.
you know, sometimes on some posts we have to turn them off, especially if
Yeah.
it's about the royal family, and I know people are going to be mad about it. I just turn the comments off because people, they just, it gets out of hand, because it's not so much that people have bad opinions. People can have whatever opinions they want, but it's the what happens is in the comments people start attacking each other, and
Oh, sure. Oh, yeah. Yeah.
that's not useful for anybody. This is
No.
supposed to be entertaining, you know.
Yeah.
And I like what you say about it being reductive, because you know, somebody born 150 years ago has a fundamental alien view of the world and geography and history than somebody born even 50 years ago. And it's so incredibly difficult to broadcast backwards our views and make them acceptable to somebody who was born 150 years ago, you know. And that's one of the things I would encourage people to do, is to read biographies like Roberts has written, because you have to fundamentally understand this person before you can criticize them and just bash them away as, oh, they were a racist. Well, it's a lot more, it's a lot more nuanced than that. There's a lot more history there. There's a lot more there, you know.
Yeah. And, something in what I would say in his positive column is, in a time when the British aristocracy was overwhelmingly anti Semitic, Winston Churchill was not. And, unashamedly so. And but then of course people criticize him because he was a Zionist in prop. I mean, I would certainly say, I mean, I think he did say he was in favor of Zionism in the sense of creation of the Israeli state. And so of course it's like, well, let's applaud him for being non, a friend of the Jews in 1900, but now we're going to throw him over the coals in 1948 because Israel is now a country. I mean, it's like that sense of, where do the shape shifting of excuse me, the shape shifting of of morals put onto individuals in the past. It's not just tedious. It's just like it also distracts from the general sense of history which I have, which is history is actually subjective, and it's about humans. It's about individuals. It's about relationships, and it like sucks all that up in a vacuum and just says, no, he's bad because he wanted the empire to remain. Well, Winston Churchill definitely wanted India to remain and was working towards dominion status to give them independence. And what was he afraid of? Oh, he was afraid that the Muslims and Hindus would kill each other. And what did they do in 1946? They had an awful civil war.
Yeah.
And so like and of course the Bengal famine, which I'm sure you know all about, and
Yeah.
the criticism of that. I mean, there are primary sources in the Churchill Archive Center. People would just Google and spend 10 minutes on this. There are primary sources of him stating, as the prime minister in the war cabinet, every action must be taken to alleviate the suffering of these people. Redirecting ships, he appealed to FDR for ships. FDR turned him down. So like, it's like, and then you'll see on social media, well, Winston Churchill was responsible for the deaths of 3 million people. And then first you're like, well, first off, how does one person kill 3 million people? That's a strange argument to make. And then second, what are the mitigating factors and everything leading up to that point? It was a natural famine, number one. Number two, Japan had U-boats all over the Bay of Bengal that would sink any ship that got close to it. So that's number two. And number three, Japan was invading Burma from the east. And there was also a world war going on. So it's like all of those like yes ands, yes buts are removed from the conversation. But I will tell your readers or your listeners, do yourself a favor as I did, get off social media.
Yeah.
your life will be much improved. And realize that there are people out there who share the way that you view the world and want to have, fact-based discussions on history. There's many of them. You will not find them on social media.
Well, an interesting point there you made is that I'm a big fan of the Rest is History podcast
I
hosted
love
by,
that podcast.
yeah, Dominic Sandbrook and Tom Holland. And Dominic Sandbrook made a really good point a few months ago on one of their podcasts. I don't remember what it was about, but he said that the people in the past that we study, they don't have all the information that we do looking back.
Right.
And, if you think about World War II, well, in 1940, 1941, the Holocaust hadn't even started. So you can't, things like that. They don't, the historical
Oh, of
figures,
course.
they don't have all the information that we do. And we also have a tendency to not avail ourselves of all that information and to understand, why they would have taken actions that they did.
Well, I think it's like I always say to, we engage with students, periodically, and I always say to them, like, think of history as the actions taken by people as they're today. Like what, put your, like, you don't know what's going to happen tomorrow. Think of September 10th, 2001. You know,
Yeah.
nobody knew what was going to happen the next day except for a handful of people. And so all of these massive historical points in history, you only operate with the knowledge and information you have at hand. And you're right, you don't know, FDR is going to die in April 45 and Harry Truman's going to take on, and, it's just all of these things. And so, like, once you take that out of the equation, I think that's when history starts becoming fun and interesting, because it's almost a game of mystery of what did these people know. Like, let's determine what they did and what they didn't know and talk about that aspect of it, versus let's determine why they didn't do this. Well, it's like you can't answer that question without answering the former question of what did they know and what did they not know. And that's where I think it's a very fun, thing to pursue.
Yeah. And that kind of dovetails to my next question I had for you. What is most frustrating to you about coverage of Churchill in this day and age? And I know we kind of already touched on it a little bit, but what is, do you dread reading a headline like Churchill said this or Churchill creates controversy?
It's funny. So I used to get a little annoyed by misquotes of Churchill. But I'll give you an example. So this weekend, I got an email from the Daily Mail saying, "Hey, would you like to comment on Eric Trump comparing his father to Winston Churchill?"
Oh,
And I was
God.
like, "That's not even. I'm just going to delete this email right now.
Yeah.
No upside to responding to the Daily Mail about this." I think the most frustrating thing, setting aside the historical, conversations, is, the International Church Society is proudly a nonpartisan organization. We think Churchill transcends partisan politics, and his record shows that he transcends partisan
Yeah, he
politics.
was in multiple different political
Right?
parties.
Multiple difficult, yeah, exactly, represented many places, and so what's frustrating to me is when one side or the other tries to capture Winston Churchill for their own.
Yeah.
This happened, frequently in the Brexit debate, right? Winston Churchill. The great thing about Winston Churchill, which I think frustrates people, what I actually find fascinating, is that his point of view. He said so many contradictory things about so many topics that it's like trying to, sift through, and figure out what he actually felt about something. And, you could say that everything from the House of Lords, when he was a young liberal MP, said the House of Lords should be abolished. I don't think he felt that way in the 50s. So, but it's frustrating when somebody gloms on. So just like we were talking about, somebody gloms on to the worst thing he said or something they disagree with, Churchill and the suffragettes. They glom onto it and they say, "Oh, that was him." Distilled, that's how he felt about it. That was his worldview. Same thing is frustrating when, somebody from a political party gloms on to something that he said which resonates with them today, and they say, "Oh, this quote is indicative of Churchill's support for X of what I'm pushing." That is a very frustrating thing for me and for the society. And I think, I was quoted, I don't know if you remember, but Ron DeSantis, got out of the presidential race and unfortunately used a fake Churchill quote. And, I gave a few interviews and I wasn't in any way attacking Ron DeSantis. It was more of like, let's talk about why people in Ron DeSantis's position of power reference Winston Churchill. That's the important part for us, is that he's maintaining relevance, but of course the narrative goes from, Ron DeSantis uses the wrong quote to, he's an idiot. Oh, why is he comparing himself to Churchill? Ron DeSantis isn't Churchill, blah, 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 blah. And the society is like, no, 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 we're just telling you the quote's inaccurate. And thanks for going to our website. Please join as members. You know what I mean? That's where we stop.
Yeah.
But it's that sense of Churchill being grabbed by left and right, which is frustrating.
Yeah, it does frustrate me. I'm I'm a left wing kind of person,
Sure.
and I'm the last person that should love all things Churchill when you look at the record. But I actually think Churchill belongs to both sides of the political spectrum because there's good and evil in the world, and he is a beacon of standing against evil, and not just Nazi Germany, but against the evils of communism and other evils in the world. And I think that he belongs to all of us. And for any political party to try and claim him, it really annoys me. And as you said, it annoys you too as well. So I'm glad to hear
Yeah,
that.
and I think when it comes to, you know, Churchill was genuinely liberal,
Yeah.
genuinely so. And I think it's frustrating when, Winston Churchill with Ernest Bevin, they were the ones who conceived of the NHS. If you read Churchill's earliest speeches, in Dundee in the early 1900s about um, universal health care, paying for workers to work on the weekend, giving them a 5-day week. I mean, these are things where you're like, wait, is this an American labor lawyer saying these things? And no, it was Winston Churchill, because he was responding to, Winston Churchill, for me, is one of the most iconic political, specifically politician, in the sense of he responded to his people, to his constituency. He represented a very poor Oldham in Manchester, and then Dundee in Scotland, very working class, aristocrat he was listening to them, he was responding to them, and he was trying to advocate for them. And then they threw him out multiple times because he wasn't doing so. I mean, that Winston Churchill's political life is a very interesting story, because he was both the beneficiary and also, the tragedy of politics, of democracy. And so I think he's a great case study in that sense. And yeah, I just think, you could go to Winston Churchill and find that quote, which, certifies your worldview and says, man, me and Churchill, we're like buds, because, he advocated for the gold standard. And I actually really think we should go back to the gold standard, even though it destroyed their economy. You know what I mean? So like
Yeah.
everything that he did, you could. So again, I think it's fun up until a point, and then it becomes detrimental.
Right. Yeah, and I think, we look back and we think of him as this great defender of democracy. We think of him as he saved Western civilization. He saved Britain's democracy in World War II. And when you think about the world he was born in, it was not democratic or free in any way. And that's
Yeah.
the world he evolved into as his political career developed, as the franchises increased, as women got the vote and became more democratic. And so now you have, and people often don't realize that when he achieved power and greatness, he was already at retirement age,
Yeah. 60,
and yeah,
he was 65 years old when he became prime minister.
yeah, and this was his third act
Yeah.
as a career. And a lot of people don't realize that he represents how your life changes, how your country changes over time, and
Yeah.
how people have to change, and how that can benefit everybody, really.
Yeah. It's a very astute point. I completely agree with you. His lifetime, his like life trajectory is, it overlaps with so many exceptionally amazing things.
Yeah.
The atomic bomb, television, radio,
Cars.
all of these things, are
Airplanes,
airplanes. And he's like, he had this strange, uncanny ability to be kind of involved in a lot of things, like petrol. I mean, he switched the British Navy fleet from coal to petrol. So you know what? If you were looking for something to criticize him for, you could blame him for climate change, because it was the largest change from coal the gasoline or oil. Um, and yeah, I mean, he just had this uncanny. I mean, the tank. Winston Churchill was the one who he didn't, you know, specifically create the tank, but it was his idea to say, hey, what if we put a bunch of people into an armored vehicle and send it over no man's land? That was his idea. And then other people came around and, and actually put it into action. So he had this incredible ability to be curious and thinking outside of the box. Oftentimes his ideas were, nonsensical, not nonsensical, but, impractical. But other times they really hit the mark. You know what I mean? I mean,
Yeah.
but he both benefited and suffered from that. The Dardanelles campaign was his idea, and if executed better, it probably would have significantly changed World War One. But it was poorly executed, and he fell on his sword. So, but he was trying to think outside of the box. Like, how do we? We're running into a brick wall every single time we send troops over the front, over the trenches. What can we do to circumvent this absolute killer of humanity of the Western Front? And again, it's that spirit of curiosity and endeavor which to me separates Winston Churchill from others. His personal um like his personal courage, both in trying things intellectually, but also what does he do after the Dardanelles? He goes to the front line for 7 months. Then he almost gets killed many times. Could you imagine a current politician going to the front line of a war right now after having some sort of fall from grace? That
No.
is like that separates Churchill from me.
Well, and the way I like to look at it, he was born in the world of the horse and buggy, and he died in the world of the rocket ship.
Yeah,
Like, I mean,
yeah, the jet engine for sure.
yeah, such a massive amount of change in one period of time. So we can't. It's so we are not justified in going back to criticizing little things he did or said
Right?
during that amazing period of time of change when the people who were living through it probably couldn't grapple with the changes that were happening.
Yeah.
So, okay. I think we'll wrap it up with one last question. So this year is an important year for Churchill Remembrance. It's the 150th year since he was born. That will be marked in November.
Yeah.
So what's ahead for the ICS other than the conference and the task of celebrating all things Churchill?
Yeah, so we have the conference. We have, quite a few chapter events going on around the world. We are putting out a special issue of Finest Hour later this year, 150th anniversary. It's going to be larger than a normal issue. And we just continue to do what we've always done, which is, we do fellowships for undergraduate and graduate researchers, run out of George Washington. And, we could just continue to say, it doesn't end after this year, right? It continues. So I'm actually already started to focus on 2025 just from a strategic point of view. But yeah, look out for that special issue of Finest Hour. Again, it'll be larger in size, a little better design. So that'll be a collectible for sure.
I read it cover to cover every time it comes.
Great.
So well, thank you so much, Justin, for taking the time to speak to us. It's been a
Yeah.
great conversation about Churchill, and I hope that I look forward to meeting you in person in October, and I hope we can have you on the podcast again.
Yeah. Jonathan, see you then. See you in October. Take care, everyone. Thanks for hosting me.
Thank you.